I looked at it, the more I realized that I needed to rethink my assumptions about the brain and consciousness and life and meaning. So it was a kind of a disruptive period for me, just like emotionally, to have to rethink my whole life, really. Because like I said, I thought life had no meaning. Consciousness comes from the brain, the body's going to die, and consciousness is gone. So you can try to come up with meaning during life, but it was just a rationalization. That's how I looked at it. And I think that's, again, what the kind of the orthodox scientific community would endorse, is that, we're just kind of biological machines that have a finite period, and that's it.
Well, I used to think too, many years when I was younger, I would think just like a computer, right? Your hard drive crashes, the computer burns up, whatever, right? Or your motor blows up in your car. It's over with. It's done. And that's how I used to feel for years, that, hey, when I die, my assumption was that was it. Everything I learned, everything I'd gone, learned and went through is over with for no reason. All the hell people in good that people go through is for nothing. But then, the last few years, talking to, some guests, I started realizing I think there's a lot more out there, a lot more.
Mm-hmm. Well, I had the same realization, very similar to you, where I didn't think that way, and then I became exposed to material that really opened my eyes. So it led me down a path of really intense research outside of my day job, where if I wasn't working, all I wanted to do was read and listen to podcasts and listen to people talk about these things. And the more I researched, the more I realized that there's actually a lot of credible science behind this, from the U.S. government, from Princeton University. The former dean of engineering at Princeton ran a lab studying these things for almost 30 years, and I didn't even know about it when I was a student there because it was so controversial. The University of Virginia, the Division of Perceptual Studies at their medical school, looks at these sorts of things. So I was stunned to see that, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
So it was a shocking realization to me to know that there was so much out there. And this exploration began as a personal endeavor. It was just for me to uncover what I could and think about my own life. I wasn't planning on writing a book initially. And it came about in the summer of 2017 after I had been researching for about a year. What I realized is that when I began to tell friends about the research that I was doing and some of the scientific evidence, in addition to some of the challenges to the mainstream perspectives, just from a logical standpoint, which we can talk about, people were telling me that it had a major effect on them, that they sometimes they couldn't stop thinking about it because it would imply the need to rethink their lives and meaning. That's kind of what happened to me. So I realized the combination of my personal passions with the fact that many people seem to be interested in these topics, it led me to say, well, why don't I just try to put this on paper? And I took the 4th of July weekend, which was a 4-day weekend in 2017, long weekend, and I just basically stayed in my apartment for the whole long weekend and wrote as much as I could. And I ended up actually writing more than half of the book, or at least a draft of it. And then over the next few weekends, I had a full draft of a book, and that's the one that came out. So this really was not something I had anticipated.
It doesn't sound like it, but what I find interesting at your age, you even being interested in the subject, because most people your age, I'll be honest with you, they think about, job, careers, they think about sex, they think about marriage, and other things, but they don't think about what you're talking about. And most people really don't till they get a little bit older. So you kind of like jumped ahead like 20 some odd years there, my friend.
Well, like I said, I think the questions have always been there because I would think about the meaning of events in my life. Like any of those topics you mentioned, like maybe it's progressing in my career. Those were things that I would be thinking about a lot. But then there's a layer below that, which is, well, why does this matter? Why is it that I care about this so much? So I was always analyzing those deeper questions. And like I said, the conclusion I came to is, well, none of it really matters, but I'm going to keep going anyway. And I think from what I found in speaking to people about this, I think that's kind of a common mentality, actually, of, well, we don't really know the answers. Life probably doesn't have meaning, so let's just try to enjoy it.
Well, I'll tell you what, really, if you got a minute here, I'm going to tell you a little story. My father had Alzheimer's, and he was also suffering from dementia. And the last year and a half, he was nothing more than a vegetable in a nursing home. I mean, he didn't even, the last year, he wasn't even talking or nothing. The year before that, he didn't even know who I was or any family member. And that's how bad it was. But, I got a phone call one day at my place of business, and the doctor says, hey, get down here really fast. And it was like, maybe an hour drive to where he was at. To get there. And I get there and the doctor says, your dad is totally coherent. It's impossible because he has virtually no brain left, but he's totally coherent and he wants to talk to you. And I was talking to my dad and he was totally coherent. I mean, he was asking me, about my business, how things are going. It was like we talked to each other like the day before. I mean, that's what his memory was like. It was like from like a couple years ago to now. But he was just totally coherent. And then he started talking strange things like, well, I was talking to your mom and I'm going to go see her today. Well, my mom died a few years before that. And then he started talking about, my uncles and some other family members. But he was totally coherent. He wasn't crazy. He wasn't strange. He was, and we were talking about like when he worked at Boeing's, he was an engineer. He helped develop part of the SST program. And we were talking about all this stuff. And then all of a sudden he tells me, hey, you got to go now. I'm going to die in a few minutes. Now, I didn't think anything of it, but, the doctor said, hey, maybe I should go because he's, tired. By the time I got home, I get a phone call. He's already passed on. But it's strange. It seems like he was totally coherent and communicating with my mother, communicating with my uncles, and, and other relatives and telling me about, what they were saying, what heaven was like and all this stuff. It was so strange. It started getting me to think that there's more than just, flipping a light switch off and we're dead and that's the end of it.
Yeah, well, I'm glad you mentioned that story. It touches on two of the topics that I discuss in my book. So one is called terminal lucidity, and it's exactly what you just described. It's where a person who has had an illness that has caused some kind of a mental abnormality for a long time, but the person kind of snaps out of it shortly before they're about to die. It is reported often in Alzheimer's patients where they have this lucidity that comes out of nowhere, and then they pass on, typically soon after that. The other phenomenon that it is reminding me of is something called deathbed visions, which one University of Virginia psychologist has reported that this comes up in 41% of dying patients that she examined, where they have this experience that you described of kind of seeing other realms and sometimes even seeing deceased relatives and seeing them clearly. So it's like something is happening with one's consciousness when they're getting close to that point of death. But this is a really important phenomenon because it contradicts what mainstream science would say about consciousness. Because if we think consciousness comes from the brain, which is the conventional perspective, usually you need a fully functioning brain to have a lucid experience. And yet in this type of an instance where someone has Alzheimer's, there is a damage done to the brain. So you would expect the consciousness to also be damaged, which it is most of the time, but then there is this period of lucidity. That is something that is not well explained by the conventional model. But if we flip our perspective, and this is why my book is called An End to Upside Down Thinking, what I argue in the book is the brain is not producing consciousness, but it's the other way around. Consciousness is primary, and the brain is like a processor for consciousness, almost like a filtering mechanism, such that the consciousness kind of exists independently, and the brain is picking it up, but the brain actually limits what we perceive. Therefore, sometimes when we see damage to the brain, whether it's in a case of Alzheimer's or terminal lucidity or a near-death experience where the person has almost no brain functioning or minimal brain functioning, or with psychedelics where studies show that people have reduced brain functioning associated with a heightened experience, like a trip. These are all instances where actually reducing the brain's functioning is related to a heightened form of consciousness. It's like the brain is a filtering mechanism, but somehow when these phenomena happen, it unlocks the filter, and allows us to perceive a much broader reality that we're typically just filtering out.
Oh, wow. So have you done any, medical stats on this to back up anything in your book, or is it just mainly from listening to podcasts and doing research and reading?
So the book is full of science and citations, hundreds of citations. And the reason I did that was, first of all, if I'm going to write a book with my name on it that talks about such topics that are so controversial, there has to be evidence for it, number one, for me personally. But I think more importantly, I just know how people with my educational background and business background look at things. So I wrote it for the person that says, show me the evidence. Otherwise, I'm not even going to read it. So the book is all the evidence suggesting that these things are actually occurring. And like I said, they come from credible places like the U.S. government, from Princeton, from the University of Virginia, and many other credible places, and peer-reviewed journals that all point in this direction, which is putting into a big question the notion that consciousness comes from the brain, and instead suggesting that consciousness is not localized to the brain.
Oh, wow. So how out of curiosity, how long has your book been out on the streets, and how's it going in sales? I mean, are people getting ordering it and all that stuff, and is it going over good?
So the book came out on October 9th, so we're nearing 2 months, and on Amazon, it's currently a number one bestseller in its category. So I think people are picking it up, and I was fortunate. I think this has also helped with the credibility of the book, that a number of very credible scientists and people in the field have endorsed it. So just for example, and just to give your readers a sense for this, because I'm not a scientist, but I quote many scientists in my book and put it together. A Nobel Peace Prize nominee named Dr. Irvin Laszlo is one of my endorsers. Eben Alexander, who's a former Harvard neurosurgeon, he wrote the book Proof of Heaven, is endorsing the book. Professor of neurobehavioral sciences at the University of Virginia named Dr. Ed Kelly, and a number of other scientists like that they all read it and they endorsed it formally with a quote. So I think it helps because these are people from different areas of science that are reading it and are saying, look, when you put the science together, it is a sound argument.
Yeah, I really do, because I mean, there's just so many things out there, that I have witnessed at my age, with people passing on, talking to their spouses, and the communication that they claim that they get and have gotten, from their husband or from their wife. Strange things like one of my, a guy is going to be on my show as a host. I mean, he seems to really get, what do you call it? He's a medium, and a lot of information flows to him in the paranormal, which is really scary. It really is. So it makes you, think that things are real out there, after the light switch is flipped. And then if there wasn't, I mean, why would the government spend millions and millions of dollars, when they did in the past anyway, for remote viewing? I mean, it proves that the psychic ability does exist.
I totally agree with you. And on the point of the U.S. government, I think it's a really important one, because if there's any organization that had a real incentive to use these things for practical purposes, it was the U.S. government during the Cold War, which is when they ran this 20-plus year program using remote viewers, essentially psychic spies, people who use their minds to view something that was far away. Now, in my research, I have a whole chapter on remote viewing. I looked at the books from the laser physicists at Stanford who were running these studies. I looked at what the remote viewers themselves said. But to me, what was really compelling, and I included this in the chapter, the CIA declassified documents from the program. And I'll read you a few quotes from these documents.
Oh, please do.
And these were very clearly, previously secret documents that are now, anyone can go to their website. Direct quote: remote viewing is a real phenomenon and is not degraded by distance or shielding. It's a pretty big one. And then they show a science panel that looked at this, and they include people from Los Alamos, from Caltech. The next slide is the science panel's report, principal findings, and I'll read you a few of the findings. Direct quotes: implications are revolutionary. Evidence too impressive to dismiss